and go deep south and then southwest. Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. How about Texas? Missouri, let's not leave Missouri out, which is a separate issue here because of the Northwest Ordinance, which actually forbid between Ohio and the Mississippi rivers slavery. Yet when Missouri comes in, what's going to happen here? Slavery. Although the southern part of Missouri was sectioned off as the Arkansas Territory. And yet when Missouri comes in as a slave state, the North got a bone when Maine comes in as a free state. Well, let's be real. You're going to have plantations up in Maine? I don't think that's happening, but they're doing the math. That's the thing. They're doing the math. Now, the other side of the coin here is, how does this structure Southern society? Simple. Most Southerners don't own slaves. They didn't. They didn't. And so you are going to begin to see something, a hierarchical structure here. The plantation owner, again, most don't own slaves. The small farmer. Now, how is the small farmer important here? Well, some of them would like to be plantation owners, but they are selling their grain, their hay, and their livestock to the plantation owners. They don't export that stuff. They don't export those goods. That is absorbed by the plantation owner. And as the plantation owner takes in those goods from the small farmers that are around them, he's producing that rice, that sugar, that cotton, the tobacco. Well, let's not forget indigo. That was another one. The British fancied that. And so he is the one growing the export crops. And as I mentioned last week, again, you get down to the economics here. The average small farmer was worth maybe $1,700 and some odd dollars and change. That's dollars then. The average plantation owner, worth over $24,700. Agrarian power, financial power. What does that breed? You put one and one together, what do you get? 2, political power. Who do you think controls the agenda politically down south? It's not the small farmer. It's not the small farmer. In fact, this helps to foster that provincialism, ruralism, where these plantation owners, they're fiefdoms. They have these plantations with the small farmers around them. They run that agenda. These plantation owners run that agenda. It's not too unlike what you're seeing here, what you saw in Europe, but more importantly, Russia, Tsarist Russia. Because sometimes I like to call the Southern aristocracy America's boyars. The landed gentry in Tsarist Russia, the boyars, yeah. They're the ones that kept the Tsar up here. The boyars. The Romanovs. Of course, we don't have Romanovs in the we don't have a Romanov class in the United States. It stops with the plantation owners. This ruralism or this provincialism retards the growth of cities down here. By 1860, there's only one southern city, population-wise, in the top 10, and that's New Orleans. Approximately 168,000 people. The other 9 are all up in the north. All up in the north. And so when you take a look at this Southern aristocracy, let's not forget, too, small businessmen in the cities, Richmond, Charleston, so on and so forth. They don't have the political power. They exist, too, because of the plantation system. But at the same time that these Southern aristocrats, if you want to call them that, the Southern aristocracy, landed gentry, they corral that political power, and this is a quintessential example here. Too much land and too few hands. I don't know if I mentioned the book last week that I have in my collection, Confessions of a Monopolist. Did I mention that book? Frederick Clemson Howe. I wanted that book and I found it. It's written in 1906. And he said, if you want to be rich in this country, really rich, turn politics into a business. And the quintessential motto was, making society work for the few. Well, that's what the landed gentry's doing here. That's exactly what they're doing. Most of the governors down south, what do you think they are? Plantation owners. Most representatives at this point in the U.S. government, reps and senators, plantation owners. They run it from the top down. Now, it's interesting here when you get into numbers here pertaining to how many were really slaveholders. I found this research fascinating. In 1860, there were only 385,000 slaveholders in a population of 9 million. Let's clarify the 9 million here. Just under 4 million are black. They're not citizens. In no way can they take part and consent to the governed. So let's call it what it is. 9 million whites here. 385,000 are slaveholders. The greatest concentration of slaveholders, once this really gets going here, is Georgia to Louisiana, 1/3. 1/3. Taking ownership of 20 slaves as the minimum for membership in this planter class, a study of census data reveals that the great majority of Southern slaveholders could not be called planters. In 1860, 88% of them had fewer than 20 slaves. 72% had fewer than 10. Nearly 50% fewer than 5. You really can't consider them plantation owners by comparison here. Most of the planter class owned at least 20 to 50 slaves. Approximately 10,000 owned 50 or more. 3,000 owned 100 or more. Talk about a restricted clique, a class here. Wow. Fascinating. How about the slaves themselves? Isn't that an expense? Isn't that an expense? Of course it is. You get into the 1820s, the prime slave that you wanted to be this engine of capitalism, agrarian capitalism, was the black male 18 to 26. And in the 1820s, it cost approximately $500 on the auction market to get one. Of course, when you advance here, keep in mind as you advance and you're breeding them to staff these new plantations going deep south, southwest, out to Texas, the older plantation owners get the head start. They're breeding them and selling them, renting them, whatever the case may be, to these new plantations coming up. And it's estimated that upwards of 100,000 will be shipped. And that doesn't count the numbers that the new plantation owners are going to breed once they get them. Isn't this a version of human trafficking here? Wouldn't you call? I would. I'd call it that. I'd call it that. Harriet Tubman is one of those that got caught up in this. Her mother and father, her real name was Araminta Ross. That was her real name. And she was one of 9 children. 3 of her brothers and sisters will be just taken from their parents and sold off to the new plantations. And she said, this is not for me, and she beat feet. She escaped. And then the saga starts here. And so what you're seeing here is a most perverted form of human trafficking. Just in some instances, taking children, young people, maybe 10, 12, 13 years old from their parents, and selling them and shipping them off to such and such, whatever that plantation was. What a system this is. And yet at the same time, some of these Southerners are going to say we were the defenders of states' rights and we were the real defenders of the Constitution. For who? For who? That's the issue here. For who? But this ability to foster this landed gentry does retard industrial expansion. The northern business interests, are concerned here too, because after a while, as they're expanding here, And they're concerned because they're doing the math in Congress. They don't want the Southerners here taking control of the political agenda in Washington. I'll give you a case in point here, 1826. Many of the Central and South American republics had a big conference here in 1826. I think it was in Peru, I believe it was. And as they're having this big conference, these republics down there outlawed slavery. Well, Congress wanted to send representatives to this conference. And the South filibustered. Well, these people down there had outlawed slavery. Do you think we want to send representatives to this conference? No, we don't. So the South filibusters. By the time the North is able to overcome that filibuster and they send 2 congressmen down to this conference, the British have already beaten us here. The Brits have already beaten us here. And by the time these congressmen get down there, one of them died en route. And by the time this representative named Sargent gets there, conference is over, and the British inked a bunch of trade deals at our expense here. Why? To preserve slavery. Now keep in mind the importance of slavery, because many of the products here that are being put out, again, the cotton, tobacco, so on and so forth, is being processed where? Up north for export overseas. And so these crops that these southern plantation owners are growing, they're being processed up north. And as they're being processed up north, the northern factory system is growing. Interesting here, this Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian as the salt of the earth is being suborned because they're exporting their products north for eventual export here, processing for export. And this growing system of factories is going to suborn and eventually overcome the South. How many of them really understand this? Do they really understand this? No, because the Southern aristocracy is making more of the money here, not the small farmer. So the small farmer, who cares? Who cares? Yet, this individualism that is part of what you're seeing here with the Southern aristocracy, this growing individualism. I own this area. I own my plantation. Nobody can tell me what to do. I run it. I'm the Lord of this. And the small farmer is allied. Why? Because he's tied to the plantation system. He's not a member of the firm, so to speak, but he's tied to the plantation system. The great political power enjoyed by these Southern aristocrats or these plantation owners in their fiefdoms is really something interesting. Now, how did they keep their slaves in line? It's another aspect of this, right? How do you keep the slaves in line? There were a few of these plantation owners that, if you want to use the term incorporated, they might own more than one. There were a few that owned 2, 3 plantations. You think you can be in all 3 at the same time? No. So you hire what? An overseer. This overseer, to show you how the system is, this overseer, these are long hours. They're very long hours. You've got to make sure that the product is being pulled and then shipped out. And how do you keep these slaves in line? Well, how do you think they're going to do this? It's not going to be a nice system here. I mean, this is really, for want of a better description, a concentration camp system. That's what this is. And this will be perpetuated, folks, many, 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 many more years under the stars and stripes than under the stars and bars. Let's understand that one. Slaves who were a problem could be disciplined. Maybe they could be put in those stocks. You probably went to Fort William Henry. Remember the stocks? You went in, take a picture? Yeah, you remember those. Or the lash, which could be used liberally depending on the overseer. Or mutilation or even castration for men. If a slave escaped and the slave owner couldn't catch him, they sent out a group of people who were called paddy rollers. It was in other words, a goon squad. And they were virtually a law unto themselves. They were greatly feared by the slaves, the paddy rollers. And it was these guys, it was their responsibility. Of course, they're getting paid for this. You're actually it's a team of bounty hunters, if you think about it. And they go get the slaves, and bring them back, because that's the property of the slave owner. Again, the prime slave was a black male, 18 to 26. And in the 1820s, it cost the slave owner some $500. Prior to the Civil War, around $1,800. And where do you think the price went by 1862, 1863 with the war? Sometimes $3,000, $3,200, $3,500 for a prime black male. Now keep in mind, where are the women in all this? Many of the women were domestics. People like Harriet Tubman, when she became like 12, 13, it was out into the fields, clearing brush, taking out the trash, so on and so forth. But many of these black males of prime age, you know, I'm sure you've seen old plows, horse plows, oxen, that kind of thing. Sometimes in these plantations, there were no horses or oxen pulling the plow. Guess what was pulling the plow? 4 or 5 black males plowing up the land. Not a very nice existence here. Not a very good existence. Truly wasn't. But this is the power wielded by the Southern aristocracy. And even though they want to keep this power, and they're trying not to advance, you can see here aristocracy around the globe, by around the globe I'm talking mainly in Europe here, are being suborned here, are being suborned. You are seeing here, and just to give you an example here, following the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, that royalty in Europe is trying to foster a new balance of power to maintain their primacy here on the continent. The ideas of the French Revolution, liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism, aided and abetted by the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, technology. They want to kill these ideas in the womb. Kind of late for that. Those horses are already out the barn. Too late to close the door. Because you're going to have revolutions here, 1820-21, 1830-31, and then the big one, Springtime of Nations, 1848. Of course, part of that was spurred on by famine. Remember the Irish potato famine here? 1 million died. Where did 1 million come, though? Germans? Where'd they come? You know, 20% of the Union Army were Irish and Germans. Add another 180 blacks in a blue uniform later on. And you're going to hear more about that later. And so these ideas are spreading here, and you're seeing here more, you know, like in 1830 in France, the last Bourbon absolute was out, Charles X, replaced by Louis Philippe of the House of Orleans, who's now a constitutional monarchy. You are seeing this movement. Well, Queen Victoria was a constitutional monarchy. She wasn't absolute. You are seeing this overtake the absoluteness of the divine right of kings here. Yet down south, we don't have monarchy per se, but the absolute power of the landed gentry here within their fiefdoms can't be overcome by the ballot box. How is it going to be overcome? War. That's what it's going to take. That's what it's going to take. And again, when I come back here next week with the Confederacy as a revolution, you know, after Henry Clay's gone, after John C. Calhoun's gone, who were ardent Southerners, but they didn't want to see the nation torn apart. They didn't want to see that. Because as you get into the 1850s, these firebrands come along. But that leads to one more question here. What about this idea of secession? You think it just was 1860, 61? Yeah, that's right. Somebody just said earlier. How about the nullification crisis, 1828? And again, 1832? You know, your Congress, well, not your Congress, Congress back then, passed the tariffs to protect northern business interests from European competition. Well, what do you think the Southerners are thinking here? What happened to our products? What happens when we export our products to Europe? You don't think they're not going to be hit with tariffs? And so the Southerners begin to think here, especially in South Carolina. They begin to think here. You know, you go back to 1798 and Jefferson, the Kentucky Resolves. and Madison here too, with the Virginia Resolves, that the Constitution is a compact. Now, what is that supposed to mean? It's a compact. Big on states' rights down here. And so perhaps, if the federal government is doing something that suborns states' rights, what is a way you can solve that problem? Seceding? That's not what Jefferson and Madison really looked at. That was in response to, if you go back to 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts here, going into the quasi-war with France. You know, the so-called Jeffersonian types, the Democrat-Republican Party, were so-called allied with the French, or had an affinity for the French. The Hamiltonian idea, the Hamiltonian people, the Federalists, were more allied to, had more of a fond outlook on Britain. Well, and so as the Federalists have political power, what do they want to do? They want to cut back on Democrat-Republican writings, speeches, so on and so forth. And another thing too, because there were French here, the Alien and Sedition Acts. The aliens, they have to be here at least, what is it, I think 10 years before they can become a citizen. And so the Federalists are trying to get around the Constitution here to suborn or even eviscerate here the Democrat Republicans led by Jefferson. And so here you see in 1828, the idea of this Kentucky Resolve comes up. You know, if the federal government is going to work against us down here in the South, what's the possible answer here? Secession, South Carolina. And interestingly enough, Andy Jackson is trying to impress upon them, you know, if something is passed in Congress and you want to overturn it or try to overturn it, you go through the process. You have elected officials. Try to have them change it in Congress, change the legislation. Isn't that supposed to be rule of law here? Somebody ought to remind some of these people down in Washington that today, huh? And Andy Jackson adds, oh, by the way, anyone who wants to secede will be hung from the highest oak tree. You can imagine what he would have done to the Bundys out there in Oregon. And so a potential problem here with the South is put off until 1860-61. Because by this point, you know, there's a party coming up called the Republican Party. And the poster child expression of that is going to be a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And by 1860-61, it's probably at this point too late to reach an accommodation. Even with things like the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, where if Northerners knew there was an escaped slave, had to turn them over to the authorities so they could be sent back to their owner. Or the Dred Scott decision. You know, Dred Scott thought that originally, or his lawyer, that originally the Missouri Territory was part of that Northwest Ordinance. You couldn't have slavery here. So if I'm born in this place, what does that make me? A free man? No, you're a slave. You're a slave. Even things like this won't salve the South. They're leaving. They're leaving. Pretty sad testimony here to the development of the country at this stage here. But again, go back to when the country is formed. This notion of the Jeffersonian idea of the agrarian as the salt of the earth and the Hamiltonian notion of industrialization / finance. Right at the beginning, this factionalization will start. And even though George Washington will warn against this, that warning really in the end will go unheeded in the end. Because when people start something, aren't they overtaken by events? The events determine the agenda, not the people. That happens. And as someone who does a lot of military history, research, that's a poster child expression of war. And that's exactly what's going to happen here after the beginning of what you call the Civil War. Fascinating where this is really going to go. Anybody have any questions or comments here? Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the Southerners, the power was with planters. Where was it in the North?
You are seeing the beginning here of the growth of the industrialists and the big bankers here. Of course, one of the saving graces here, that's an interesting point, because one of the saving graces here of the American Republic and how long it really lasts here is there was always land for someone to grab over the next hill. Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. And so I can't make it in New York, Philadelphia, or this little town here. We're having a problem economically, so let me go 10, 50, 100 miles, 200 miles, grab 50, 100 acres, and I'll make a go of it. That's really American imperialism. We're not like the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, Spanish, so on and so forth. We don't move in with an army and put a flag there, this is ours, the end of the discussion. No, it's people like yourselves who are looking for that land over the next hill. How are they going to keep a hold on you? They can't. Go back to what John Adams said. If you want a functioning system of representative government in this country, the wide ownership of land is required. And so as we're expanding, it's hard to keep a tight rein on people. However, keep in mind here, even at this point, prior to 1860, most Americans don't like corporations. They thought they were a threat to the republic. And yet, where is the country going? Because you're going to see here, as this war gets going, and that's going to be the last talk here, how this turns out to be an industrialized, corporatized war. And it's a warning as to what's going to be coming up here in 1914, and how about 1939? To give you an example, in 1940, the Roosevelt administration, I have a number of, I got friends both Republican and Democrat, but some of my Democratic friends like to tell me that Franklin D. Roosevelt, how much of a liberal he was. I thought a hogwash that was. The guy was a banker, liberal. He was pragmatic, I'll give you that. Of course, what's he going to say at the end here? I didn't save the worker, I saved capitalism. That's what he's going to say. But in 1940, because he knew what kind of war was coming, he launched, God bless you, he launched this initiative known as the DPC. Ever hear of this thing? 1940, Defense Plant Corporation. It's a corporation paid for by the taxpayer. Taxpayer was the stockholder. What was it for? To build millions of square feet of factory space so companies can produce war material. That's what it was for. In other words, the arsenal of democracy here. And so what you saw here was this, again, this further blending of big business, big government. Interesting what you're seeing here. Where this is going to go. Where this is going to go. Because in modern war here, beginning with the Great French War up till 1945, if you don't have factory space, if you don't have the money, if you don't have a large population to replace losses here, guess where you're going? And then it gets to be, it wasn't so much in this war, but after 1914, and you better have that one resource that can grease the wheels. Oil. Oil. You see where this is going to go here? A part of this comes out of your Civil War. Interesting. Fascinating. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how the federal government exerted influence over the country in this period, and as far as taxation, what they did with taxes, how they...
Nobody wants to pay taxes even here. But as the country's expanding here, and the federal government, it's all for this. Now, why is that? We're pushing a contiguous empire here. That's what we're doing. And as the people push this empire further west, you know, it's interesting. It's not the businessmen and the bankers leading this. It's people, and some of them are immigrants. You know those people we don't want here anymore? They're helping to push this. Why? Get out of Europe and get myself some land here before it's gone. And at the same time, interesting here too, now that you brought that, interesting here too, there's another country going through this, a manifest destiny of sort. Take a look at the Brits, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, so on and so forth. They had an empire due to what? Navy power. Navy power. That's not the United States at this point. We're on a contiguous landmass. There's one other country doing the same exact thing, and they started it before we do. Tsarist Russia. Only there's a whole lot more time zones here. And so as Americans are spreading west and the federal government supports this, are there taxes to be paid? Yeah, there are. But as big business expands, is the government taxing some of the? Of course they are. But keep in mind, you don't have the tax structure now you're going to have after the Federal Reserve and then income tax in 1913. You know, so when you're talking about money spent by the federal government, keep in mind in World War I, this is fascinating, in World War I, for the short time we're in this war, it's going to cost the taxpayer, the federal government, $22 billion. That war cost $2 million an hour. When I was doing some research up at Army Aviation Magazine, 1968, 1969, Vietnam was costing you $14 million an hour. And that was a loser. And so that's more money, $22 billion is more money than the federal government will spend from 1791 to 1914. Well, did you have Social Security then? Did you have Medicare? Did you have a real public education system to pay for? Did you have any of that? No, you didn't. That's before big government. But you're seeing that process begin here after the Civil War. And you're going to see us moving in that direction with things like unionization of workers. You know, it's a total package here. It's a total package. And the Civil War, if you're asking about taxes, the federal government here up north, they're only going to finance the war 13% with a currency. They're going to have taxes, but guess who's going to invest in the northern economy? The British, the French. They're buying up the bonds. They're going to invest in the South. Why would you invest in the South for? You're going to invest in the North. Why? You're not going to pick a losing horse here. You're going to pick a winner. Yes. Well, they're tied to the plantation system because they're selling their hay, their grain, and their livestock. However, even in the South, this idea of individualism is big with Americans anyway. It's really big down here. And so it gets to the point here where the North, they wanted to destroy Northern influence down here. And to do that, you're going to have to destroy the Union. That's what the Confederacy is going to be about, destroying the Union. That's revolutionary. But it's a revolution from the right because the black isn't going to be able to take part in this. He's property. And if you want to apply the Nazi notion, he's Untermensch. Subhuman, not even human, he's property. Unpaid toilers, living and breathing property here. And so as this idea proceeds, the small southern farmer, who's intensely individual and is fighting to keep his land, when you ask some of these people, the testimony that I've seen, how come you joined the plantation, or how come you wanted to fight? Because this is my land and you're on it. Land can do a lot of things. Land can put people in a fighting mood. Look at what happened in China. Look what happened in Vietnam. Look at what happened in Russia. Look what happened in your own country in 1776. Land. We want land. And we don't want you here. Plus, there's the idea that the southern ambiance here. It's all a total package here. But the small farmer will join the plantation owner to preserve what's known as Southernism, the new Confederacy, to be independent of the federal government. Because at this point, if you substitute British bankers for Northern bankers, Substitute northern business interests for British business interests back in the 17s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s. There's no difference here. The South feels oppressed, and the small farmer is going to go with it. But then again, at the same time, if the Southern aristocracy controls the political agenda, they also control the propaganda agenda, and you know how this is. Individuals think, the mass can't. Hitler wrote that in Mein Kampf. Yes, and then I'll move over. Yes?
You just mentioned that the slave was considered a tool for production.
Mm-hmm.
So, must be a limit of the ability of this unit of the production to produce X amount of the goods. So, there was not a kind of a law that limited the growth of the plantation. Couldn't go more because there are too many slaves you cannot control them. So can you tell us a little bit how much land 1 unit of the slave would do?
How much?
Output. Like you have 1 cow and live
Right.
10 acres.
Right.
1 slave, what was the dimension in relationship to the plantation?
That, to be honest with you, I have to do some research on that. It's a great question. That's a really great question. How much could 1 slave put out? But when you look back and you take a look, again, go back to 1698 here in the Tidewater area, they put out 20,000 pounds of tobacco. Yet, by the beginning of the American Revolution, they're putting out 83 million pounds. That's an increase in production. And so by the beginning of the American Revolution, you have about 655,000 slaves in this country. And so those 665,000 slaves are pushing out 83 million pounds of tobacco by 1770, 1775. They're also pushing out almost 80 million pounds of rice. Cotton is playing catch-up here after the American Revolution, and that's going to be considered the poster child expression. Of course, cotton will increase in production with Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And especially when they begin to go from South Carolina into Georgia, Arkansas, so on and so forth, cotton production is going to grow exponentially here. And as I mentioned, by 1860, 4 million bales? It's a lot of cotton. Of course, by then, you've got not 3,953,000 slaves here by 1860. So, I could probably find that out. How much, of course, then again, it depends which plantation. They're not all going to be the same. Right. Yes? And then I'll move over. Yes? No.
The federal government earned most of its money from tariffs and taxes on whiskey, for one of the better expressions.
Yeah, booze.
Who?
Booze.
Who pays most of the taxes or the tariff that prior to 1860? The North or is it the South?
Well, there were land taxes. And so you are...
Federal.
No. Well, you're going to have local taxes to pay.
Yeah,
But keep in mind here, that question you're asking here, how did the federal government, and she's going along with her, how the federal government was able to operate here, especially when you get to the 1880s, 1890s, going into the 21st century. Guess what would happen when the government needed money? John D. Rockefeller, the Morgans, so on and so forth. The robber barons were helping to foot the government here. And so, but what does that mean? They're currying influence here? Because John D. Rockefeller in the 1790s was urging a lot of the people in his class, we are not, repeat, not going to make the money we want to make with free market. You couldn't vote for your senators then, remember that. They were appointed in the end by who? State legislators, right? So what's Rockefeller's idea? Let's put the pressure on the state legislators so they can assign those senators to Washington that will pass those rules, regulations, laws, and resolutions that will allow us to corral the economy. He's already talking about a corporate state here. He's already talking about a corporate state, which is why you're going to have by 1913 what? The ability for people in this country to vote for their senators, which is not the original intent of the founders, and also what's passed, the Federal Reserve. And now with the coming war, guess what's going to happen? Taxes. Why? You got big government. Yes, someone had a hand up over. Yes, and then I'll move back. Yes.
Yeah, done a fair amount of reading on this, and I try to figure out, by your numbers, about 15% of the people in the South were slave owners. So that leaves 85% who were not.
Right.
Why did they?
Approximate.
And the South had a much smaller population than the North anyway.
Yeah, sure did.
Huge disadvantage. Why did they fight? And I thought about this, and the rebel who's asked, why are you by the Northern? Why are you fighting? Because you're here. But
Right.
beyond that, and it's something that I came up with, that still the vestiges of exist, particularly in the Southeast states, and that is the promise of white supremacy. No matter how low you were as a white, you were better than the best black,
Right.
With a PhD from Harvard or something.
Right. Well, that's what this. In fact, I give a 4-talk set on what I call the American Gulag, and part of this system is going to reinforce racism and its sordid progeny, white supremacy. You're going to see that. And so when you look at the South here, you're already seeing this sordid institution of this concentration camp system is really what it is. But at the same time here in 1860-61, do you honestly think many of these Southerners really understand the gravity of the Industrial Revolution at this point? I don't think they do. And I think they consider, and I'm going to get into this more in the last, their military strategy, because that has to be taken into account. And so I don't think they take into account here where the world is actually going. This is a closed area here. They don't want outside influences here. And so they're trying to seal themselves off.
Even the 85%?
Well, they don't know as much.
They don't count. They have no power.
Well, correct. They don't have political. Well, the few are pushing the many here, is what you're seeing. Yeah. And so the average Southerner is not as well educated as the average Northerner. In fact, in 1860, the average Southerner was making $103 a year, the average Northerner $141 a year. And so you are seeing an economic disparity here. Of course, part of that disparity is what? There's more factories up north. Wage earners. Well, yeah, and they're controlling the resources too. So somebody else said, yes, sir. Well, that's where you're going.
And part of me says, when you said, oh, today I did contemporary events, that part of me says, okay, all the discussion of the past, what's the future tense look like? Because it seems like these trends talked about are still with us.
Gee whiz. Holy Christmas. As far as God made man, yeah, God made man equal. Yeah, God made men, Colt made them equal. Remember that saying? Yeah. Remember that saying? Yeah. That's why they sold a lot of Colts. The spirituality end of this is important, because I remember reading a quote from a Southerner when I was doing some research for this. I take my religion like my individualism, straight. Or no, I take my religion like my whiskey, straight. Were many of them religious? I guess to a certain I guess to a certain extent they were. Although interestingly enough, as the black man is acclimating himself to his situation here, they're adopting the white man's religions. Methodists, Baptists. Interesting. And then you see them get away from African names, and they're taking names like what? Jefferson, Washington, Madison, so on and so forth. They're acclimating themselves to their situation here. But they're stuck in eternal bondage here, this purgatory of indentured, of being unpaid toilers. There's just no way out of this. But then again, it's imprisoning Southerners too. Again, getting back to what you're saying, I think you're intimating here, this idea of going to racism, white supremacy, because that's going to be carried on after 1865 with Jim Crow laws, the KKK. You know where this is going to go. One more question, and that's... Yes, yes, ma'am. Well, keep in mind, by the 19th century, generations had been stuck in this, and so I'm sure you know that some people, when certain people get into a groove, they seem like they can't get out of that groove. But then again, how are they going to get out of it? At the same time, they need that spark, and the war is going to prove to be that spark to get them out of that. Well, take the Assyrians, for instance, and I always go back to this example. The Assyrians, right, they moved from the coast in the Middle East and the Levant area into Mesopotamia. They occupied about 5,000 miles. There are about 100,000 of them. And yet, they were picked on by all the surrounding empires and realms, so on and so forth. And they were farmers, they were traders, so on and so forth. They did a complete 180. They gravitated to the military arts. They went from being apathetic, lazy, apprehensive, to being one of the most brutal people in history. Guess what? Nobody bothered them anymore. People understand force. Spoils. And of course, if you have to, it's always like Stalin once said, when one person dies, it's a tragedy. When 1,000 die, it's a statistic. And Uncle Joe dealt with statistics.